I lived in New York for 6 years when I was doing my PhD, so this is like a really nice homecoming, but about, of course, a very unpleasant topic. And so, as a segue into that topic, I want to clarify that there aren't a whole lot of people who know that much about the Rohingya in general, and I don't want to pass myself off as an expert. A lot of this is pretty new research, and what it does is tries to challenge or at least contest both people who are telling the Rohingya who they are and who they're telling them who they're not, as we open up the opportunity, or use that as an opportunity to think about what will identity and politics mean for these people going forward. And I guess that kind of comes through in the title, which is trying to put some of the voices that have been excluded, and then I was able to kind of find, or at least tap into when I was in Cox Bazaar, and then around the Southeast Asia region, back into the description of this world historical crisis. So I'm going to start with an anecdote that I think kind of frames some of the problematic aspects of the Rohingya identity, or at least how it's been mediatized and put into discourse. So these two women are Myra McGuire and Tolkol Carmen. They're both Nobel Peace Laureates. And a journalist from Yemen on the right, and the one on the left is an Irish peace activist. And they went to Cox's Bazaar. This is where the refugee camps are, and of course I'll speak about that more in a moment. And the one on the left yelled out to them over this divide, both physical and perhaps ontological and political, and she said, "Always stand with pride and identify as a Rohingya. 3 cheers for Rohingyas. You should always say that you are from Rakhine State and that Burma is your country." And while on one hand this is kind of, I suppose, a nice, if essentialist, pep talk, it's also a little bit weird for someone to go around the world and towards a group of people who have been destroyed or in the process of being destroyed for this identity, to encourage them to identify with it, to take it on, to always stand with pride. Now, they kind of find themselves in a sort of strange agreement with hyper-nationalists in Burma who call them not Rohingya but Bengalis. So they have different names for these people, but they insist that it is what they are in the blood. And so while I want to not really decide one way or another who is who, or what we should necessarily call them, I think identify a weird parallelism in this kind of insistence that we can figure out for sure what these folks are without really listening to them. And so I want to identify a set of discourses around this ethnonym that is Rohingya and figure out what it has come to mean and why that's so important for the politics of indigeneity in Burma, and then trace how actual people on the ground who have been called this and maybe under other circumstances would have reason to want to be called Rohingya have trouble with this identity. I mean, the obvious reason is that the identity has been so, the people who call themselves Rohingya have been so buffeted by this violence that they have reason to try to avoid it. And so that, of course, is doing weird things to the identity, the Rohingya identity, even as what we might call elites, or who are part of the ethno-nationalist project, the Rohingya ethno-nationalist project, have a reason to try to nail down with certainty what this is so that they can achieve a sort of legitimacy within the state of Burma, or Myanmar. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the recent violence and how it fits into a longer trajectory of violence over the last 50 years. And then I'll go into the way that I'm kind of theorizing Rohingya identity, which I'm calling, with a colleague, ethnogenesis as schismogenesis, which is a fancy pants way of talking about how we tend to think of ethnicities as stovepiped down throughout history as if they always existed that same way, and as if we could talk about Rohingya now having meaningful connections to the way it existed 1,000 years ago, or the same with Rakhine, who are the Buddhist majority group there. And I am going to argue that these people shared so much cultural material that existed in the civilizational zone that connected Arakan and Chittagong in what is now Bangladesh, that if we can blur our eyes a little bit and get out of the tyranny of the colonist, he of the map and the census, who demands that certain kinds of people who look certain kinds of ways belong in different places, we'll see these people sharing a lot of actual culture. And then I'll go through some examples of that. And then third, go into what's at stake at calling people Rohingya, and how on the ground today people are both identifying with and avoiding this ethnonym, and with what kind of consequences. Okay, so the most recent facts that, to those of you in this room, you're probably aware of, last August, well, I guess now, 14 months ago, 15 months ago, a group calling itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, attacked security forces in Rakhine and killed about 100 people, border guard forces or military personnel. This was responded to with massive violence that cleared over 700,000 people from the area into Bangladesh. Now, there were buildups of troops in the area before ARSA attacked, producing a number of conspiracy theories, one of which was that ARSA doesn't actually exist and the military put this together themselves, or they were getting ready for any sort of small conflagration to turn into a large one. They would respond by saying, we're doing good intelligence work and we thought there was going to be something bad happening, so we put troops there. Nonetheless, the Myanmar military responded to this attack with extreme prejudice and probably received help from this Rakhine ethnic group, this Buddhist majority that I was talking about, who, while having majority in the southern part of Rakhine State, is actually a minority in these regions of Mongdo and Buthidaung, which are the two northern townships from which most of the extrusion occurred. Oops, wrong button. So here is, this is the capital, kind of here down, whoops, touchscreen. Here down is mostly Rakhine, and that actually, that separation took place in the 1942 mutual ethnic cleansing that took place after the Japanese occupation. So kind of indicating that this has been a long time. Like, there have been many cycles of this kind of internecine violence. And then, so the folks came here, right east of the River Naf, which is this slice there, and then across into what's now Cox Bazaar. And then during, responding to this pretense of terrorism, there was this sort of collective punishment against all the Rohingya people living in that area, and about 700,000 fled, maybe 7,000 died. Later, that number was reprised to be close to 11,000. Difficult to know because the military right now is bulldozing that area, supposedly to prepare for people to come back safely and have houses prefabricated and produced by national business tycoons as their way of contributing to the nation. But it also gets rid of the bodies and the fabric of Rohingya existence that was there. A lot of this land, at least according to some reports, has been nationalized and given to people who would be Burmese Buddhists who would be colonizing it from other parts of the country. So pretty grim situation there. And as a result, you have Rohingya from this last extrusion, but also connected to previous ones, kind of distributed across the whole world. So there's probably about 500,000 left in Myanmar. You have about 1 million in Bangladesh. So 600,000, 700,000 is different than 1 million. So the remainder comes from the fact that in 1978 and 1992, there were other mass extrusions of the population, some of whom trickled back. And so when you're there talking to folks in these refugee camps, some of these people have been forced to cross the border multiple times. This is not their first rodeo, as it were. And then as people have been distributed, growing up in refugee camps, for instance, not wanting to spend their lives there, trying to flee to Malaysia, using that as a jumping off point to other places, you have a diaspora growing wider and wider over the years. And I'll return to why that's important later. I should mention that the ARSA is led by a guy from Saudi Arabia, so his standing as a legitimate Rohingya, one who could speak for the ethnicity and who could lead these kind of events that would lead to repercussions for most of the people in Myanmar, is certainly under question as well. Okay, so then who are these people that we're talking about? And here's where I'll go a little bit into kind of a history of the ethnogenesis. All a little bit speculative because we don't have very clear materials. And I think the challenge is to think about this space and the politics that occurred there based on what we know, and to theorize it intently without getting too stuck on not being able to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. So the reason why this matters is that a lot of what we would call Orientalist historians, and I mean that in a not necessarily a pejorative way. Orientalism is the kind of idea that there's a pure center to these ethnicities or peoples, and you can find that core by going back further enough into the past, and then by looking into the archive, you can find the constitutive evidence to find these people. Now, we know, anthropologists, we maybe don't know, but we argue this is not how ethnicity works, and what you find in an archive is not evidence of how people used to live their lives. Not finding something in an archive is simply the absence of evidence, not the evidence absence, however that expression works. So anyway, I'm going to go back and theorize this a little bit with appropriate hand waving about how we don't really know what happened, but I think this might be a new way of thinking about it. Okay. So the conflict has tended to be interpreted either as internecine, so between communities, or state-sponsored, drawing upon facts that the conflict is motivated either by kind of a Buddhist versus Muslim thing, or indigenous versus foreigner kind of thing. And these things are not necessarily untrue, but the problem here, the thing that I want to challenge, is the way that the categories themselves are presupposed and reified, or turned into like concrete things that imagine they were always this concrete, even into ancient history. So the General Min Aung recently said, these Bengalis do not share any characteristics with us, Myanmar. And then Gregory Bateson, who's kind of a famous anthropologist, says that a lot of times when you have ethnogenesis, you have one group dominating the other, stealing their stuff and incorporating it or re-territorializing it as theirs, and then denying that there was ever any sort of intercommunication between the other group. So I think that if we look into the deep past, we can kind of see Rakhine, this Buddhist group, and Rohingya, what we're going to call the Muslim group, as two sides of sort of the same cultural coin. They're both part of this Arakan littoral or Chittagonian sociopolitical system that exchanged cultural material and populations for hundreds of years. But as Arakan became embedded in a broader Burma system after some historical events, including the sacking of Arakan by the lowland, sometimes called Burman Buddhists, in 1784-85, and then a corresponding schism that took place when the Mughal Empire in 1666 took Chittagong back from the Arakanese. You had this civilizational zone that had been quite fluid. You start to see these divisions, and now when the British end up showing up in 1824, they're like South Asian looking peoples, they belong over there in what we now call South Asia. Burmese looking peoples, they belong further south. But if we look into the past, that's not really how these kingdoms operated. And then, of course, because it's fun to blame the British, they tended to ossify those divisions through certain administrative practices. Okay, so why is this systemagenesis so important? Well, because indigeneity is essential to establishing belonging in a polity that is indifferent to formal citizenship. So we might say, or a liberal theorist might say, well, just give everybody citizenship, and it doesn't matter what ethnicity they are. But in a country that hasn't had the experience of a civic nationalism as we might imagine it, your ability to identify as an ethnicity actually is the sine qua non of being able to claim what we might call rights or affordances of citizenship. And that's why these kinds of things are so important. But it's not just the Rohingya are playing this game, the Rakhine are playing this game as well. So partisans from both sides of this divide are asserting ever deeper links with Arakan's past to the point of myth. And they're trying to appropriate the same cultural material as theirs and label the other side as interlopers or Johnny-come-latelys or essentially non-indigenous. This thing over here, this is the Mahamuni image. It's now in Mandalay. It was stolen by the Burmese or the Burmans when they came in 1784. According to the Rakhine, this thing was forged at the time of the historical Buddha in 400 BCE when the Buddha himself flew to Arakan. So you have an interesting mix of sort of what we might call historiography and myth. And then, so that's their way of saying we were here first. The Rohingya, on the other hand, are saying the Rakhine kingdoms that you see in the history books now, most of that happened in the 14th century, but we were actually there in the 8th century. So there's this game of everyone trying to get there first. You think you were there first, but your pile of rocks was built in the 14th century, but we were actually here even earlier. You think you were there first. Well, the Buddha came in 400 BCE. He's the one who established us. Okay, so here are some examples of the kinds of things that they're trying to take away from each other. Iconography in coins, various forms of cultural expression, everything from skin lotion to wrestling, and then religious traditions, becoming increasingly ossified or divided along kind of Muslim Buddhist lines when they used to be much more syncretic. So here's the Rakhine state emblem, supposedly a Buddhist one, almost identical to a Hindu, Buddhist, certainly Indic and South Asian 9th century emblem. So you have kind of Rakhines taking this South Asian pedigree without accepting any connection with people we might call South Asians. You have Rakhine wrestling on the left, Rohingya wrestling on the right. These images don't establish it dispositively, but pretty similar kinds of practices, but each accuses the other of having stolen it from them and then being the original ones. And now the Rohingya are not allowed to participate in what's called Rakhine wrestling. And so you talk to Rohingya folks who will tell you about how they used to be able to do these things when they were younger and are now no longer able to do what they consider to be their original practice. You have similar kinds of skincare, which in itself is certainly not noteworthy, but online you'll have people, when you circulate an image, when one circulates an image of a Rohingya person wearing Tanaka, which is the face paste, saying that's fake Tanaka. There's no way they could actually be doing that. They're only wearing that so that they can get it on in the media and make people think that they're Burmese, but they're not. They're wearing it as fakes, which is an absurd thing to say. I think we can all agree. And then religion. So you have these syncretic religion traditions becoming narrowed to exclude non-Buddhist elements in the case of the Buddhists and non-Muslim elements in the case of the Rohingya. So anthropologist has found, Alexandra de Masson has found, even in like her research over the last 20 or 30 years, that there are these vernacular histories associated with kind of like spirit cults. And the medium there on the right is emblematic of what these media or mediums look like. So instead of an Arakan king, a Buddhist king, taking a Bengali wife, which from a functional anthropological perspective would show the way these civilizations are braided together, now even in the last 30 years, people are saying, he was offered a Bengali wife, but she was insufficiently beautiful, and so he rejected her. And she, as an anthropologist, is finding like this is happening as we speak, so new history is being written. Now, Rohingya, for their part, are denying that anyone non-Muslim could be Rohingya. Even people who speak the exact same dialect, who share a lot of the same, what we might call cultural traits, are essentially say, well, that's not really Rohingya. And the expression that I get a lot when I was in Chittagong was, Hindu is Hindu. So in other words, people who, even though their religion is just slightly different, they cannot fit into the Rohingya bucket, the identity. So you see this kind of division, this rarefication and narrowing. So quickly now, I'll go into how this came to be. And it's basically a history of slavery and migration. So in the 1000 Common Era, we have the first evidence of states which are oriented to those Indic cosmologies that I mentioned. So back here, these kind of coins right here, Harikela and the kind of larger Bay of Bengal region. We don't know much about those peoples in the 1000 Common Era. We do know they weren't the ones who came to settle there later and became the Rakhine. They're the ancestor of both the Burma, the Burman group I was talking about who live in the center, and the Rakhine, the Buddhist group. So I'm repeating it so much, but new groups, so perhaps I'll reiterate, came in the 12th or 13th century. So when people say the Rakhine arrived at a certain point, it's a little bit weird. And again, that's what I want to kind of challenge, because they weren't Rakhine then. They became Rakhine over years and years, centuries of kind of ethnogenesis. But anyway, the ancestor came in this particular period. And then you had folks who had been there before. We don't know much about them. We have a civilization developing that was both wet rice producing, but also a maritime civilization, which was based on slave gathering. So if you can see where I'm going, you had a group of people arrive there. There were also another people there. And then you had slave gathering from all the way up into the Bay of Bengal. So you had a hugely diverse population starting to emerge there in the 14th and 15th century. And by the time you got to the 16th century, a very cosmopolitan place. And we know this because of the records left by Bengali, we might call proto-Rohingya poets who were at the court at that time, who were writing poems for the kings, who were probably Buddhist, but had Muslim names. So really interesting kind of melange that we don't see very much today. So here is, that's Mara'u, that's where this pile of rocks is today, and that's where the civilizational center was. And the reason why I'm pointing to here is that was the most fecund land. The problem is it was also really, really dangerous to live there because of tsunamis, because of flooding, or typhoons rather. And so if you're a normal person, and this gets back to like theories of wet rice estates in Southeast Asia, if you're a normal peasant, you don't care about surplus because you can't preserve rice, you only eat what you grow. But if you're a king and you're really committed to big piles of rocks, you need slaves to build those piles of rocks from you. You need surplus. And so if normal Rakhine people, and note the topography, really hilly over here, not a lot of surplus, you need people who aren't otherwise going to want to live there. And that's where slaves come in. So this is a quote by Michael Charney, who's a historian at SOAS, and he says, this is the most fertile and the most dangerous land. Norse people, rational people, have a tendency to avoid it. Kings wanted to keep these areas settled, especially by populations taken from Bengal. So you can see where I'm going here, that the very kings, the ancestors of the Rakhine, who now deny the existence of these dreaded Bengalis from the West, were the people who brought them there because they needed them to essentially run their civilization. So you had this interesting hybrid structure where you had Buddhist kings with Muslim names, as Jacques Leader says. And Charney finds that by the time you get to the 17th century, a third of the people are probably slaves from Bengal. So is this a Southeast Asian place, Buddhist, and the one we might associate with Burma, or is it a South Asian place we might associate with Bengal? And the answer is yes. Is it a wet rice state, or is it a maritime state? Yes. And I think the significance of that, of being wet rice and maritime, is that most maritime states would collect slaves, but then because they didn't have the wet rice paddy land that they needed to put people onto to produce stuff on, they would sell them off. But these guys actually, they were trying to run a wet rice state. So they were not only collecting these slaves with their amazingly sophisticated navies for the time, but they were bringing them back and settling them down. Here's the third of the total. And so this is a British map, but it demonstrates that with the green up there, that upwards of Chittagong, even further north into Bangladesh, was Arakanese kingdom at that period of time, until 1666 during the Mughal invasion. So if you live by the sea, you die by the sea, and you see a major and rapid decline during that Mughal invasion period. So you have the Dutch company undermines Arakanese dominant role in the bay, and that 1660 invasion took Chittagong from Arakan. With Arakan's decline, you have the end of the slave trade, you have a Buddhification on one side, and Islamification on the other, and then this was exacerbated by the arrival of the British in 1824, and that's where we kind of like fast forward to the kind of ossified distinctions that we imagine, or maybe not we, but people imagine exist today between Southeast Asia, Rakhine to the south, South Asia, South Asian peoples, Chittagong to the north. So here's where we start to get into the question of, well, who are these Rohingya people? In 1799, Francis Buchanan goes to Ava and then in Chittagong and finds these folks who call themselves Rohingya. Now, the tricky part here is that this is one piece of evidence that seems quite clear, but there isn't a whole lot of evidence after that. There's another couple of things. This is from 1811, where you see another Rohingya language list. The problem is you had essentially a fairly small group of Muslim people who we might call the proto-Rohingya. And then you have this huge agricultural machine that the British are trying to run post-1820s, where they're bringing in lots and lots more of agricultural laborers from Chittagong. And so some anti-Rohingya elements would argue that people say there's Rohingya pre-British, but what really happened was there were just a couple people there, and you had this, always the imagery of floods and hordes, but floods and hordes of Chittagonian laborers coming across brought by the British, and that's who the Rohingya are today. They're essentially Chittagonians who came across the border in 1824, more likely actually 1880 is when they started settling. Now, to a certain extent, you could say, who cares? It doesn't really matter if the date was 1824, 1854, 1750, it doesn't really matter. These people have been here for a long time, but under the rubric, the indigeneity discourse that the Myanmar state demands, these dates really matter. And so then you have kind of partisan historians saying, well, even though we don't have evidence for this, we can just presume that because there were so many of them, the Chittagonians overran the Arakanese Muslims. But what I'm trying to argue is, and in a way, maybe a slippery argument where I'm trying to have things both ways. I'm trying to say that the Arakanese Muslims, the Proto-Rohingya who pre-existed, were so deeply connected in the civilizational zone that didn't really care about borders, that those Chittagonians who were coming south were kind of the same folks. But there are also meaningful distinctions in terms of dialect and culture and interaction with the local community that we can call them Rohingya. So they were both the people who had always been there, and yet when more folks flooded in from the west during the British period, they were able to absorb them, and they became part of this identity that we now call Rohingya. And I'll pause there to see if that makes any sense. I'll skip some of this for time. It basically just says that the British were not very good at enumerating and counting these ethnicities. And so one of the reasons why anti-Rohingya proponents will argue against the Rohingya is they'll say, well, the British never counted them. There was this guy Buchanan in 1799. There were a couple of things in linguistic manuals later on. But when we actually get to the census, we don't really see them. But one of the things I want to highlight here is that the British used the same categorization project that they had in India. And in India, the census was actually a pretty useful tool because it used caste as a way of differentiating people. However, the British ran Burma out of their Indian colonial project, and it actually was a province of India until 1937. And so there wasn't the kind of intensive knowledge application to figure out the differences in the sort of ethnicities to be able to count them accurately. So you have this kind of fun paradox where lack of knowledge produced really bad knowledge. So the census, they used caste, which didn't exist in Burma. You had religion, which most of the people, 92% were probably Buddhist. You used language. Well, you know, as you find in these census records, people complaining, the census guys saying, the Burmese changed their language as much as they changed their shoes. Because people spoke one language at home, they spoke another language in the market. So that wasn't a differentiable category either. So like what Hirschman says is that like censuses are useful to the point where they're exhaustive and exclusive in categories. So in other words, something where I can tell what you are versus what you are, and you guys don't get to tell. So it's ascriptive as opposed to subscriptive. You don't get to subscribe to it, I get to tell you what you are as the colonial state. But these guys never found the right markers. They even tried to use birthmarks, which I find particularly cute. It was not very successful. Even in the censuses themselves, here's from the 1911 census, they were saying things like, we don't know what we're doing, these guys are changing all the time, this is crazy, stop making us count them in these ways because we don't know actually what we're getting up to. So the same people who would point to the census and say, there's no Rohingya in there, tend to ignore the fact that the people who wrote these censuses didn't really know what they were doing. So here we go, race in Burma is not a fixed definite phenomenon capable of presentation in a set of tabular statements. It's vague, it's an interminant. These census figures are but a presentation of a momentary phase of racial distribution. But the census categories were pretty good for doing some things, establishing this messy, mutable, and mutating middle, or muddle, that people were tended to change within inside Burma, by establishing some constitutive outsides, especially the Chinese and the Indians. People who you could say, well, we don't know what's going on inside there, but we know that the Burmese, on all their convoluted glory, are not those things on the outside. So you had these Chinese and South Asians kind of set up as extant others. and especially as the latter conformed to the classic racial physiognomy-based logic of the British census, and as the British used them in the colonial administration in particular ways. So the Chinese and the Indians being part of the colonial bourgeoisie and the clerks in the colonial administration, they became easy targets for ethnic resentment. So this brings us back to the Rohingya today. They've kind of committed this dual sin of having perceived characteristics of foreignness while also demanding an indigenous status. So for those Chinese or those Indians that I just mentioned, most of them were in strong enough positions in the colonial and then post-colonial economy that they didn't need to argue for indigeneity. They were like, fine, we're definitely other, just let us run businesses and don't be terrible to us. And the Burmese state was pretty terrible to them a number of moments in their post-colonial history, but they were never asserting indigeneity claims. Now the Rohingya, on the other hand, never had that access to resources, never had that privileged position in the economy, so they needed the indigeneity in order to be a part of the nation and to accrue sort of special recognition that would predict. And so you had this impossible demand that they're making. They look really different, but they're demanding to be the same. Okay. How much time do I have left, do you think? 5, okay, good. So here's Cox's Bazaar refugee camps today, where you have 1 million plus people, former and new, living in Kutupalong refugee camp, which is this, it used to be a national forest reserve, and that's the only reason why you have such a huge area that's available. And then Teknaf is much further south, and you can see Teknaf is just right across the way from Rakhine State. So then you have the sort of an elite, a Rohingya elite project that's trying to decide on this Rohingya essence, to going back to that indigeneity discourse, trying to say, we're not Bengalis, we're not just Chittagonians, we're actually different, we belong in the nation. And then a nationalist proponent would say, no, you're just Bengali. And they'd say, no, here's why we're actually different. And so then they would, like an example, one of the things I'm studying in my research is this group called the Rohingya Project, which is kind of like what I'm calling a techno-governance NGO based in Kuala Lumpur that proposes to use blockchain to register Rohingya. And the blockchain imagery is kind of interesting because it tries to use the power of this new technology, which asserts a sort of immutable record and an identity that can't be forged, and that it exists on a transparent ledger for everyone to potentially see, as a way of essentially inscribing in the history and present and future a sort of like, these are the Rohingya. But the problem is the markers that they're using, religious, linguistic, territorial, cultural, and occupational, and these are the ones from their website, but I think it's pretty consistent with a lot of these kind of projects, are really tricky to actually nail down what actual, like, how do these criteria actually define real Rohingya folks? Meanwhile, you have Rohingya rejecting these UNHCR cards, which are trying to biometrically categorize what people are and who they are. So unfortunately, I don't know why I got turned sideways.
Here, see the last, there's an arrow. Will that turn it? Nope, sorry.
It doesn't really matter. This gentleman was promoting people to get these UNHCR biometric cards, and he was abducted by the, probably by ARSA, it's unclear by whom, and they threatened to kill him if he kept doing this, and then put this video up there, and he's saying, I'm sorry, I'm never gonna try to give people these cards again. So why this sort of rejection? And I'm arguing that Rohingya are kind of in this like position of split subjectivity, where on one hand, their suffering turns their body into a political icon, where they have a sort of incentive to stay and suffer in sight, so that, you know, the Burmese state can't get away with genocide and ethnic cleansing. But on the other hand, you have a sort of imperative to struggle to survive and look out for your best option, especially for your family. And so a colleague of mine, a Rohingya guy whose father was abducted by ARSA, for standing up to them, said, we're trying to save our lives. People are 50-50 thinking about their people and thinking about their family. And I kind of interpret that 50-50 Not like half the people are looking out for their Rohingya ethnicity and half the people are looking out for their family, but rather there's a sort of splitting where people want to try to do both. And what some of these biometric identity cards, what they do, or what they risk doing, at least as the Rohingya people are talking about this, is that if the ownership of this data is not controlled by the user themselves, it prevents a tactical oscillation between a number of different identities. So one quote from a recent article that found that over 250,000 fake passports have been purchased by Rohingya over the last 10 years, Bangladeshi passports, which is completely rational. It makes sense. You don't want to live in a refugee camp your whole life. One person said, once we are biometrically registered, we will not be able to obtain Bangladeshi national ID cards and passports. So people are sophisticated enough to know what's going on in these enumeration processes and to know that they've been screwed before, pardon my language, and they will probably be betrayed again by these groups like UNHCR. So hence the guy getting kidnapped and people saying don't take the ID. So you have these kind of fights over identity and identification become really fraught sites. So you have this policing of identity, language, culture, occupation, whatever that could mean, seeks not only to exclude fake Rohingya passing as real, and this actually happens in Kuala Lumpur, where in order to get refugee services, you have to be Rohingya. So other Burmese Muslims who have been forced out of the country are pretending to be Rohingya. But more importantly, it's to kind of inscribe Rohingya with these putatively trans-historical features that fit this conventional imaginary of an ethnic group identity within that particular, Burma's particular indigeneity discourse. In other words, trying to nail down and make clear and legible and transparent what exactly a Rohingya is, to identify it in a kind of museum kind of way. We can point to the Kachin, we can point to the Chin and the Bama, we know exactly what a Rohingya is. I'm describing this as a sort of self-salvage ethnography in which Rohingya articulate a set of ideal features of existence that have been interrupted and corrupted by recurrent Burmese state violence. And that's one of the tricky aspects, is that because violence has been so constitutive of the Rohingya experience for the last 50 years, you have lots of people saying stuff to me like, well, we have these institutions, but they haven't been able to run since the military started treating us this way. So like go back to the metric of territoriality. When you have most of the people outside of the country or outside of the territory, their land that they're growing rice on and they're fishing on, that it's so constitutive of Rohingya identity, how do they perform Rohingyaness? How do they embody it? And when people are spread around the world, they're speaking a slightly different language. Well, what's the correct Rohingya language? What is the correct version of Rohingya Islam? And so the idea, the imaginary that you can really nail down what it means to be Rohingya starts to break down. I just stepped on my next slide. So as these people are getting distributed across the world, you have language shift in Cox Bazaar, where the people who have been there for a generation are now speaking essentially Chittagonian, if not Bengali, which are quite, depending on who you talk to, can be quite different than Rohingya. And then you have this ethnicity shifts occurring both in, where you have people who I mentioned in KL trying to become Rohingya, but you have these shifts out, where 250,000 people have got passports in Bangladesh. So there are these memes that circulate on Burmese Facebook where you have like, don't call me Bengali, we're not from another land, I'm Rohingya, etc. But even as some tactically pass as Bengali, others identify so as to reject the Rohingya nationalist project. So I kind of want to, this was most likely just a mistake in the meme, but I think it's kind of a, fun, comp-lit kind of way, indicates the mistake indicates that not everything is captured in this circle of what it means to be Rohingya. There's stuff on the outside, this accidental thing that says text. So it's not clear what the continuing diffusion of Rohingya will do to the identity, but you do see a massive outpouring of anger on part of refugees for people who are talking for them. People being accused of not real Rohingya, you can't talk for us. And that's why I kind of want to go back to the start, where people are telling the Rohingya who they are, and they're like, stop telling me who I am. And so, in a sense, I want to finish with an idea that Rohingya is a sort of impossible identity. In a sense, Rohingya are a limit case of the general agreement among social theorists that ethnic identity is a product of application of knowledge structures, discourses, and outright coercion, in a word, power, upon groups of people, rather than it naturally reflecting life patterns and culture lived by a collection of individuals. Rohingya identity is hence a sort of impossible object. The very same violent crucible in which Rohingya have been forged is also that which excludes them, and extrudes them. They are simultaneously interpolated, like called as Rohingya, by the violence that denies that name and even compels them to reject it. And so that's where I'll finish for today. Thanks for your attention.